Good morning. This programme has been told exclusively another 150 victims of the contaminated blood scandal may have died since a public inquiry into the tragedy was first announced less than 2 years ago. In total, almost 5,000 people with the disorder haemophilia were infected with HIV and hepatitis C in the 70s and 80s. Thousands more may have been exposed through blood transfusions after an operation or childbirth. Victims and their families have fought for years for a full public inquiry. We've been following their battle. It was eventually granted by Theresa May in 2017, and we're expecting the opening remarks in around 20 minutes' time. Our reporter Jim Reid has been covering this story for the last few years. So what are we expecting today, Jim?
So like you say, it's the first day of this public inquiry today, and the scale of this is very, very large indeed. In fact, some lawyers think this could be the largest public inquiry in British legal history. That's why it's moving around the country. So it starts in London today, then it moves to Belfast, it goes to Leeds, it goes to Edinburgh, and then down to Cardiff. And across all of that, they think more than 2,500 people are going to want to give evidence. The whole process could last between 2 and up to 5 years, they think, as a result of all this.
And what exactly are they going to be looking into?
So this scandal goes back, as you said, it goes back decades. But importantly, the effects of this are still being very much felt today. So back in the late 70s, early 80s, we now know that thousands of people were given contaminated blood products. And that tended to affect specific groups in society. So one group that was particularly affected were people with the blood disorder haemophilia. We now know that 5,000 of that group, British haemophiliacs, contracted hepatitis C as a result. Another 1,200 also contracted HIV. And of those 5,000, or roughly 5,000, more than 2,000, getting on for 3,000 people, have now died. So you can see the scale of this tragedy is absolutely huge. That's why we've got this public inquiry today. Of the things they're looking into are questions like, should more have been done to recognise warnings much earlier in this process? Were those warnings ignored in the early 80s for some reason? Did drug companies do enough to protect people? Were drugs being shipped from abroad, particularly from the United States, into this country that either the companies involved should have known were in some way contaminated or at least dangerous, or did they know? And also, why have so many documents, so many patient records been either lost or destroyed? Was there some attempt to cover up this scandal in some way by either the civil service or the health service? Now, we don't know the answer to all these questions. That's why we've got the public inquiry at the moment. Important to point out that in other countries, in France, for example, people have gone to prison at very senior levels because of this scandal. That's never happened here, and it's one reason why so many families and their relatives and victims want to see justice after all these years.
Yeah. You've spoken in detail to many of the victims. I have, this programme has, victims of this scandal over the last few years. What are they saying at this point?
Well, the sad thing, or one of the very sad things about this tragedy, is many of the people who were infected back then are now very, very sick indeed. In fact, as you said in the introduction, since this public inquiry was announced, and that was only in July 2017, since then we now think that more than 150 British haemophiliacs have died of complications related to the contaminated blood scandal. Now, one person we spoke to a lot on this programme was a man called Steve Diamond. He was infected back in either the late 70s or early 80s. He can't know for sure. This is you speaking to him back in October last year.
Having hepatitis C for so long obviously destroys the liver, deforms the liver. And so the blood doesn't flow around the body properly, and it creates what they call varices in the stomach wall. And they burst. And as a haemophiliac, you're in serious trouble. And that's happened 6 times in the last 2 years. One of life's little ironies is that the drugs that cleared my hepatitis C in 2015 have caused massive hearing loss. So it's almost, as Andy was saying, you just never enjoy good health throughout your life.
So that was Steve speaking to us back in October last year, and in fact that's the last time either you or I ever saw Steve. He died 2 days before Christmas from complications related to the contaminated blood scandal. His wife Sue is going to be at the public inquiry later today. This is her story of what happened to both her, Steve, and her family.
Steve was born in Exeter in 1956. He was a mild haemophiliac, a blood disorder in which the clotting process does not complete itself. The risks are more severe bleeding or bruising, but the main risks are medical interventions. Right, I don't know if you can see. Was he not dapper? But yeah, that's the young, funny, clever man. I'd actually forgotten he once looked like that. We met at university, we met at Freshers' reception in 1974 at Exeter. My strongest memory is rushing to the station to get the train, rushing onto the platform to see it was delayed again, looking up the platform and Steve would emerge from the waiting room, and that was like this great joy that I'd got his company.
For the 11:49 Great Western Railway service.
That's that bit, once it got to there and you got the clear view of the sea. We decided to actually stay together after I graduated, so for the rest of that summer term he moved in with me to my flat in Dawlish. He'd got a massive bruise on his thigh, the size of a postcard, and it worried me. And because Steve was not in the habit of getting haemophilia treatment, we sort of thought about it, and he decided he would go and have it checked out. And they injected him with the new wonder drug, Factor 8, and they told him that this was great for him.
In what is said to be the biggest medical disaster since the health service was set up, more than 1,000 people with haemophilia have been infected with AIDS antibodies.
The widow of a haemophiliac who was HIV positive has been granted legal aid.
Nearly 5,000 of them were infected with hepatitis C or HIV.
We got married in 1980. Steve had this accident, went to the hospital, and this is when the young registrar took some stuff off a shelf, said, "Oh no, we can do it here." Treated him with Factor 8, and that bruise disappeared within an hour, so it was totally unnecessary. He was told the next day that he'd been exposed to HIV, and that really put an end to our possibility of having children. So it was our first home. This is where he was, and the 18-month nightmare of the HIV testing started.
So you'd have been living here at the time?
We were here, yeah. And the phone was on the kitchen wall right at the back of the house, and I can remember the day they rang up to say that the last test had been negative, so it was considered he hadn't been infected. And I could just remember sort of seeing him on the phone and just realising then how serious the risk of HIV had been. He was told he was clear of the HIV, but no mention was made of the hepatitis C. In 1993, was told that they had found antibodies of hepatitis C in his blood tests. The consequences were cirrhosis, cancer, transplant, premature death. And that he was told that bluntly. And so we were told within 24 hours we would never have children and that he was going to die early.
Blood supplies from the 1970s to 1991 came from prisons or from paid donors in the United States. It took years to establish the risks.
The feeling that a lot of people are left with, that it might have been avoided.
I would like to say sorry on behalf of the government for something that should not have happened.
Came back to the UK in 2009. We got referred to the National Liver Centre at King's. The new treatments came on stream. The treatment worked, but his liver was so badly damaged, and on the day he was told that he had got the sustained viral response, it was considered cleared, he was also told that the blip was cancerous, and within 6 weeks he was actually being operated on for cancer.
The chances of being alive 1 year after a transplant are in...
I want to try and understand how so many warnings from as early as the 1950s were ignored. How any government can put a small, vulnerable part of their community at such a severe risk, and who was responsible. And for those responsible, I'd like them to never enjoy a night's sleep ever again for what they did.
He woke up feeling weird and vomited blood. And what they said was that his liver failure had caused his kidneys to fail, so his respiratory system and his heart would fail. And they took him up to the intensive care And the last thing he said to me was, "I love you." And he knew I was there because I'd said that to him as well. And the last thing he actually said was that he wanted those who'd done this to him to repent. And so, 1 o'clock in the morning, he was holding my hand. And he left me, but still holding my hand. This was Steve's favourite place. He told me that very recently. And the burial ground's sort of over there somewhere. But it's high like this and it looks across the moor. I want to see justice. I want to see people called to account. I want to see those who actually are found to have behaved inappropriately, be it criminally, irresponsibly, negligently, made to explain themselves, made to look at the population that they have harmed so badly. Steve's dying words were he wanted them to repent. I promised him they would, and that's a promise I intend to keep.
Jim Reid with Sue Diamond. Let's talk now to Des Collins. He's a senior partner at Collins Solicitors, who's representing over 1,000 victims and their families. Mr. Collins, thank you for coming on the programme.
Good morning.
This is a huge moment for those affected by this scandal, many of whom, like Steve, are not around to witness.
It's a huge moment. It's a moment they've waited for 40 years. It's tinged with expectation and, of course, deep sadness for the people who have died in the last 40 years. They cannot put that behind them completely.
Are you confident this inquiry will get to the truth?
I'm confident it will try and get to the truth, provided it's allowed to carry out its work in the way that it wants to. I'm not entirely confident that the vested interests, such as the pharma companies, and to some extent departments of state, will try and perhaps be as not as comprehensively useful to the inquiry as they might be.
Was there a cover-up?
Yes. There's no doubt.
How can you say that emphatically?
I can say that emphatically because we, over the past 2 years, have looked at probably 4,000 documents from the National Archive, which shows quite clearly that there was a cover-up, and I think it's now accepted by the Department of Health. I don't think they used the word cover-up, that they were possibly less transparent than they might have been. Now, in government speak, that means cover-up.
But you say you've seen the evidence that suggests that?
We have seen the evidence. It's been collected from the National Archive largely as a result of freedom of information requests. Yes, we've seen it, and it's as a result of our having seen that evidence we fully believe that the public inquiry was finally called.
We've received this message from Nigel, who's texted us. Nigel says, "I have never told my story before. I've always been a very private person. I'm a haemophiliac. I was given contaminated blood products which gave me Hep C, which then gave me cirrhosis. I now have untreatable liver cancer. This scandal has killed me. I will not be around for the end of this inquiry. My wife died in 2012 from breast cancer, leaving me a single parent for our 7-year-old daughter. Now I am going to die, leaving my beautiful little girl without her mum and dad." Oh gosh, it's so upsetting. "I want justice not for me now, but for my daughter." I mean, there are some people whose stories we don't know about, who have been affected by this.
So many stories that no one knows about, and one of the things that's come over to me in the last 2 years that I've been working on this is that the baton has now been passed from the last generation to the next generation. The people who fought for 40 years, they're getting tired, they're getting worn out, they've become slightly defeated, but their children are now out there fighting, and fighting very well.
We've also had this email from a woman called Helen, who says she had her first child in a hospital in South London in 1978. It was difficult delivery, but her son and she were fine in the end, but she lost a lot of blood and she had a blood transfusion after the birth. She says, "Since becoming aware of the contaminated blood scandal, I've been wondering how I would know if I picked up anything nasty from that blood transfusion. Would it have become obvious by now without any tests?" She says, "I'm pretty healthy for my age, 65, but it's always in the back of my mind." What should Helen do?
What Helen should do is go and be tested immediately. We don't want to involve ourselves in scaremongering tactics because that's wrong. But if someone is frightened, that fear can be taken away very quickly by a number of very discreet tests, and that's what she should do now.
But do you believe there are people who have been affected by contaminated blood who may not know about it?
I think there will be a number of people, there have to be a number of people out there who don't know about it.
What sort of numbers?
My own view would be about 5,000, no more than that. There are other figures.
That's a big enough number,
yes,
though.
yes, there are other figures floating around, but that's the maximum I would have said from the research we've carried out.
Right, okay. Because we've got a good idea of the number of haemophiliacs involved. We think around 4,800, but the sort of blood transfusion group, that's the group that we're not so clear about.
That's right. The haemophilia group have been very well organised over the years and been pressing for this public inquiry and pressing for reforms to government and administration. The people who went through whole blood transfusions have been less organised, and they're the ones who will be more at risk of not knowing what happened to them.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Collins. Thanks for coming on the programme. We appreciate your time. Thank you.